Chapter 16. My father doesn't call again for the rest of the day. Maybe he thought that call in the middle of the night counted as today's call, Marilee says. We're in front of the TV watching the evening news, something Marilee says she tries to every day. This strikes me as odd since my parents never watch the news, never read the newspaper. Maybe Dad checks out the events of the day online when he's working, but if he does, he never tells me or Mom about it. It's as if my parents would like to forget the rest of the world exists. I don't want to think about my parents or the reasons my father hasn't called. I concentrate on the TV. The newscaster's talking about that embezzler who just got out of prison. Dalton Van Dyne's his name. $6 million disappeared from Diggesburg during Van Dyne's tenure as CEO, the newscaster says. Most of the money has never been found. I'm thinking that the big words used in the news, tenure, embezzler, sound like they should be fun, but they have such boring meanings. Embezzler should be someone who goes around buzzing a kazoo all the time, not someone who steals money. Marilee sighs. Crime is so complicated nowadays, she said. Did I tell you my husband was a lawyer? He always said it was scary how stupid most criminals were. I guess they have to be smarter now. She gets a faraway look in her eye. I remember when Tom and I got engaged. My parents were so proud because they were going to have a doctor and a lawyer as my sons-in-laws. It's funny how stuff like that used to matter so much. I'm busy trying to think of a more imaginative definition for tenure, so I almost missed the news hidden in Marilee's reminiscing. Then it registers. Wait a minute, I said. My dad was your parents' other son-in-law. Dad's not a doctor. Marilee gives me a baffled look. He was, she says. I try to picture my father as a guy in a white coat or green scrubs. It's easier to imagine him blowing a kazoo. He's a money manager, I say. He sits at the computer all day long. Marilee opens her mouth to disagree as if we're playing a childish game of I know Walter Cole better than you know Walter Cole. Then she seems to reconsider. Maybe, she says carefully. It was too hard for him to continue in medicine after what happened to Elizabeth. Too hard to watch other children die. I seem to remember Hillary saying something about him maybe switching into medical research. I guess even that hit a little too close to home. Marilee turns back to the TV, but I don't. When did Mom say that, I ask. At Elizabeth's funeral, probably, or Tom's. That time period is just such a blur in my mind. I do remember thinking it must have had to do with them donating Elizabeth's organs. They were able to keep her alive for a few hours after the accident so someone else could benefit. Maybe that inspired Walter somehow. Really, I say. This changes how I've been thinking about Elizabeth. It makes everything worse. Not only do I have the dead sister I never heard about before last night, but her heart and lungs and kidneys and other organs, her eyes, are still alive in other people's bodies. This is like one of those late-night horror movies Mom and Dad never let me watch. Marilee punches a button on the remote control to turn off the TV. Are you okay, she asks. I didn't mean to upset you. Upset? That's the same word Dad had used as an excuse for not telling me about Elizabeth. I'm fine, I lie. Marilee's still looking at me doubtfully. I wouldn't blame you if you were upset, she says. I shrug, and Marilee seems to get the message. So Walter's a money manager now, she says. Yes, the past few years he's mostly worked from home. He's semi-retired. I try and make it sound ordinary and dull. I want ordinary and dull rather desperately right now. I'm sure Hillary appreciates that. You too, Marilee says. I know that was one of Walter's regrets, that he was away so much when Elizabeth was a child. He always said that if he had it to do all over again. Her voice trails off. I think about how my father is always there, waiting, when I get home from school. I think about how, when I was little, he and Mom both tucked me into bed every single night. I think about how he helped me with my homework, let me braid beads into his thinning hair, let me win Candyland and Trouble, and I think about how he's as good as vanished from the face of the earth since the last time I talked to him. 17. Somehow I managed to sleep through the night, survive into another day. At the breakfast table, Marilee is fidgety. Do you think, she begins, I mean, if it's all right with you? What? I say, even though my mouth is full of coffee cake. Marilee got up early and baked this morning. I would like to go to church this morning, Marilee says. I need to. Going to church is something else my parents didn't do, like watching TV news or reading the newspaper or telling me about long-lost relatives I never knew I had. Why, I say. Oh, because your daughter's a minister and it would look bad if you skipped? Does she keep track of whether or not you go? I'm a little amused at this notion. Marilee laughs too. It's not like that, she says. It's more that this has been an emotionally wrenching couple of days for me too. Church always makes me feel better, more focused on what really matters. If my parents went to church, would that have prevented them from dumping me on Marilee? Would it have prevented them from disappearing? So go, I say briskly. Do you want to go with me, Marilee asks. I wince. That woman from the Y, Tammy, does she go to your church? Marilee tilts her head to the side, her eyes full of compassion. No, she says. Would there be anybody else there who would look at me and remember Elizabeth? I don't know, Marilee says. Elizabeth never had glasses like yours, so that kind of hides the resemblance. Tammy saw you without them, and you're a lot taller than Elizabeth was until right at the end, those last few months. I'm sure everyone remembers her as being a tiny little thing. It's funny how she was always so petite, and it was like her body suddenly decided, oops, I'm supposed to be taking after my 6'4" father instead of my 5'1" mother. She went from being the shortest on her gymnastics team to the tallest practically overnight. I get chills as Marilee chatters away because she might as well be describing my own growth spurt. I went from being the shortest to the tallest in my age category on my swim team. Coach Dinkle changed my nickname on the team roster from Waterbug to Giant Mermaid. Elizabeth was your sister. It's not surprising that you followed the same growth pattern, I tell myself. Marilee clears her throat. I guess I've gone a long time without answering. You know, it shouldn't matter if people recognize you or not, she says. Now that you know about Elizabeth, I can introduce you as my niece. You can meet people who knew your parents when they were your age. I shake my head, not even tempted. I should stay here in case my dad calls, I say. He could leave a message, she says, or call back. You shouldn't feel trapped here. I don't, I say, which is another lie. Marilee doesn't look like she believes me, but she bustles about, changing her clothes, gathering together her coat and her purse and her Bible. The phone rings as soon as she's gone. Daddy, why didn't you call yesterday? I ask before I even say hello. Click. I feel my face get red. Obviously, other people besides my father might have reason to call Marilee. It just seems odd that whoever this was didn't bother to say anything. I've just hung up the phone when it rings again. Hello? Bethany? This time it is my father. Dad, I waited all day yesterday for you to call. We've had some complications, he says, his voice sounding strained and anxious. I can't talk for long, and I'm not sure when I'll be able to call back again. Is Marilee there? I'm stung. He hasn't seen me in 2.5 days, and he's barely bothered to say hello. She went to church, I say. She'll be back at 11:30. She left you alone? He asks, panicking. Daddy, I'm 12 years old. Lots of kids my age stay by themselves for hours. Some even babysit. This is different, he says. Tell Marilee she needs to keep you with her all the time. I say, because I'm not sure I'm going to tell her that. I change the subject. Daddy, she told me about Elizabeth. I'm a little angry with my parents right now, but still, I wonder if I should offer some condolences, some sympathy. I'm sorry, my father says, if I'm the one overcome with grief for the sister that I never met. It would have been better if you'd never had to know. Never, I say, anger rising again. How ignorant did he want me to be? Before Thursday night, had he ever thought about introducing me to Marilee? Had he ever planned to show me Sanderfield, his and Mom's hometown? How could he have kept such a chunk of their lives secret from me? And why did he want to? Bethany, he says, there's a lot you don't understand, a lot you can't understand. This isn't the way I wanted everything to play out. I'm doing the best I can. The pleading in his voice is so bald, I feel my anger ebb. Okay, I say, trying for steadiness, but when are you coming back? I don't know, he says. Everything has changed. Be strong. That's something my father has never asked of me. Before, now, my parents just expected me to be cute and cuddly and entertaining and happy. They wanted my happiness most of all. What changed? Everything. Tell Marilee I'll call her back later, my father is saying. We need to talk about arrangements for you and school. We can't have you falling behind. It's only after we've both hung up that I realize what that means. If Dad's worried about school, this isn't just a 2 or 3 day jaunt, a mini vacation from my typical life. This is long term. I bet they never did anything like this to Elizabeth, I mutter into the silence of Marilee's house. Chapter 17. 18. When Marilee comes home, she's in a good mood. We have a quick lunch and then she scurries around getting everything ready for Joss's visit. I tell her Dad called and will call again, but I don't say anything about school or her needing to keep me by her side at all times. Dad can tell her that himself if he wants to so badly. Okay, good. I'm glad you won't have to keep worrying about him, Marilee says, but she's concentrating on polishing the huge antique mirror in the hallway. Can you hand me the Windex? I pick up the bottle of blue liquid. She switches to cleaning the window and the front door. Is Josh some kind of neat freak, I ask? Marilee laughs. No, but I used to be, and I always think Josh might expect to see everything the way it was when she was a kid. I thought you lived in this house around the corner. It bothers me that there might have been some holes in Marilee's story. What if I can't trust her either? Josh and I moved here after the accident, Marilee says, still scrubbing. We moved in with my mother. I have a grandmother? I look around, almost as if I'm expecting some super old granny to come popping out, some other relative my parents hadn't bothered telling me about. Marilee lowers her Windex bottle. Mom died the following winter, she says. That was a really horrible year for us. Did my parents come back for her funeral, I ask. Marilee hesitates, then shakes her head no. I suspect it was too hard for them coming so soon after Elizabeth's, she says. But you went, right? I did, she says. I wanted to, and Tom was supposed to be the executor of her estate. She'd never changed that in her will. So the job fell to me. I handled all the details. I was experienced by then. I was used to dealing with death. I'm not sure what it means to be executor of an estate, but it sounds hard-edged and businesslike, heartless, doubly difficult for someone in mourning. And meanwhile, my parents were AWOL just like they were now. Bethany, Marilee says softly, all that happened a long time ago. She goes back to scrubbing windows. It's just a shame that you never got to meet your grandmother, though. She doted on her grandchildren. Josh and Elizabeth, I think. Not me. By the time Josh shows up, Marilee has the house in perfect order, and in spite of myself, I'm a little curious about what Josh will be like. If she looks like me too, I'm just going to scream, I think. But as Josh lets herself in the front door, calling out, "Hello, anyone home?" I discover she's a younger, thinner, darker, and more intense version of Marilee, all sharp elbows and knees where Marilee is padded and round. Joss is also wearing a sweatshirt with rolled-up sleeves and jeans with a hole in the knee, which really shatters my image of what a minister should look like. Marilee rushes out of the kitchen, gives Joss a hug, and surrounds her in a flurry of questions. Was there much traffic? How'd your sermon go this morning? Are you hungry? Then they both seem to remember me. Bethany? Marilee calls. I scramble up from the couch where I've been half hiding, feeling awkward and out of place. There you are, Marilee says, beaming. Joss, this is Bethany. Bethany, this is Joss. Josh looks at me, and for a second I see the same mix of surprise, awe, shock, and horror that showed up in Marilee's face when she first met me, and in Tammy's face when she saw me at the Y. Then Joss smiles, hiding her first reaction. Glad to meet you, she says, and she sounds so sincere I want to believe her. She shakes my hand, and that almost makes me feel like a grown-up. Minutes later, we're all back in the kitchen with Marilee. I never knew preparing a meal for 3 people could take so much effort. I'm slicing onions, and Marilee's shredding cheese, and Josh is talking about a member of her church who told her on the way out of the sanctuary today, "Well, you certainly, used a lot of words in your sermon today." What did he expect? Hand signals? American Sign Language? Josh acts indignantly as she tears lettuce for our salad. He probably didn't mean anything by it, Marilee says. He just didn't think. And you don't know what might be going on in his life right now. I know. I should use his rudeness as an occasion to grow my own compassion, Josh says, sighing. I will. Later. I just need to vent right now. You don't want Bethany to get a bad impression of you, Marilee says. Why not, Josh says. Better that she know what I'm like right away. Here it is, Bethany, I'll tell you now. I'm the black sheep of the family. I thought you were a minister, I squeak out. Joss laughs. Ah, but I'm in the wrong church according to my mother, in the wrong city because St. Louis is much, much too far away, and she probably would have been happier if I'd gotten married about 10 years ago and cranked out 2.3 adorable grandchildren and... Joss, stop, Marilee's laughing again. You know I'm very proud of you. Joss shrugs and rolls her eyes at me, and I think it's kind of nice after all having a cousin. Why did you become a minister? I ask, sliding my onions into the sauce Marilee has bubbling on the stove. Joss stops tearing lettuce and glances quickly at her mother. Marilee nods almost imperceptibly. The year I was 13, Joss begins, I spent a lot of time grappling with God and trying to understand life and death. After the accident, you know, and then it just seemed like I would have been a big waste not to put all that theological thought to use. Because you figured out all the answers, I ask. Hardly, Joss says wearily. Just figuring out all the questions. I don't think there was a single one I missed asking God. She dumps her lettuce into a salad spinner, and the next thing I know, we're talking about movies and books and TV shows, safe topics. As we finish cooking and sit down to eat, I can tell Marilee and Joss are steering the conversation away from anything controversial. They're trying to make me feel comfortable. I'm simultaneously touched and relieved and a little bit insulted. Don't they think I can handle talking about anything important? I wonder, anything that hits a little closer to home than the new remake of The Parent Trap? We eat Marilee's pasta and homemade bread and salad, and she clears away the dishes. Then there's a lull in the conversation as she brings out chocolate cake she made this afternoon. I turn to Joss and say, what was it like growing up with Elizabeth? Joss raises an eyebrow at me and glances at her mother again. Go ahead, Marilee says quietly. Joss shifts in her chair. You might as well ask me what it was like to grow up, Joss says. I can't imagine what my childhood would have been like without Elizabeth. You were 12 when she died, I say. And as far as I'm concerned, that was the end of my childhood, Joss says. She peers at me so intently, it's all I can do to keep from looking away. But I want her to see I'm not afraid of hearing about Elizabeth. Elizabeth was a lot of fun, Marilee says, putting a slice of cake down in front of me, full of energy. Those two girls did nothing but giggle when they were together. Joss gives Marilee a look I can't quite read. She turns back to me. Do you want to hear a eulogy, she asks me, or one of those we won't speak ill of the dead, what a saint she was descriptions, or do you want the warts and all version of Elizabeth's life? Warts and all, I say. I swallow hard. Part of me really wants to hate Elizabeth because she belonged to my parents before I did, because she, I almost say, ruined them, but how can I blame Elizabeth for her own death? Because she had them when they were younger and happier. I'm surprised I've allowed myself to be so honest, but something about Joss's gaze seems to make it safe. Joss gives me a simple, sympathetic smile. Part of me always wanted to hate Elizabeth too, she says, especially after she died. Can't miss someone you hate, right? But even before, when she was still alive, Elizabeth was always prettier and smarter than me. She was a better gymnast too. It was like she had a huge advantage being born 2 months earlier. She walked before I did and talked before I did. She learned how to read before I did, and she was better at everything. Joss, Marilee sounds scandalized. You know that's not true. Elizabeth wasn't any prettier or smarter than you, and you were just as good at gymnastics, even better sometimes, especially toward the end. I'm just saying how I felt at the time, Joss interjects, and it's really not fair to compare our gymnastic abilities those last few months after Elizabeth grew so quickly. It wearily threw her off, being so tall all of a sudden, and I think she would have adjusted if she'd had more time. I decide I'm glad my sport is swimming, where height doesn't matter, and then I remember something I hadn't thought about in years. When I was in 1st or 2nd grade, we'd done a gymnastics unit in school, and the teacher had been impressed at how quickly I'd picked it up. She said I had a lot of natural ability, a phrase that stuck with me because I thought it had to do with nature, and I kept imagining myself with vines and leaves growing all over me as I did somersaults. I can remember feeling proud when the teacher sent a note home with me recommending I take gymnastics lessons. Maybe I was hoping to grow leaves, even though I had to have known that was childish and silly. Anyhow, my parents had said no, absolutely not, no gymnastics for me. That was because of Elizabeth, I realize now. At the time, I hadn't cared that much, because when they refused to let me do gymnastics, they let me join a swim team instead. I probably started daydreaming about growing fins, not leaves. But now I think natural ability, that's practically the same term merely he used to describe Joss and Elizabeth's gymnastic talents, naturals, people said. Apart from their little rivalries, which I admit Hillary and I probably didn't help, Joss and Elizabeth were best friends, Merle says, and I'm grateful for the distraction. Sure, worst of enemies and best of friends all rolled into one, Joss says, taking a bite of her cake. Ever since those athlete personality profiles they do during the Olympics, Elizabeth and I spent hours figuring out how ours would sound. She lowers her voice and imitates a self-important sports announcer. In a tiny town in the middle of nowhere, Illinois, not one but two talented young gymnasts harbored Olympic dreams, cousins Jocelyn Wilker and Elizabeth Kroll. We were always debating about whose name should come first. I always said it should be by age, youngest to oldest, and Elizabeth always said it should be alphabetical, Kroll before Wilker. Wait a minute, Kroll, I say? Not Cole? Joss looks over at her mother. Oops, she says.